Professor Alexander is a professor at the university, at the Department of Cultural Analysis at the University of Klagenfurt. She specializes in border studies, anthropology of the political, ethnographic mythos, and Europeization processes. She has also researched discourses and practices around football championship in 2012 in Poland and Ukraine. So I encourage those of you who don't know her work, who are interested both in identity politics or in negotiation of Europeanness in European borderlands or in football. So I encourage all of you to have a closer look at her outstanding works. You can Google some of them, you can read some of that online, as far as I did, so now I can share that information with you. So I think you can get familiar with Alexandra's work, not only on refugees, but also on anthropology of politics and identity politics. Haunted by refugees, populist politics and media discourse after the summer of migration. That's the title of today's talks of Alexandra. So the floor is yours. Thank you for coming to Warsaw and visiting our institute. We are happy to have you here. Thank you.
Thank you, Ivona. Thank you so much for inviting me. Thank you, Agnieszka, particularly, who made this possible to invite me here. It's great to see so many familiar faces here. Thank you also for this kind introduction. My presentation today, I would like to talk about the relationship of populist politics and media discourse on the one hand, and the securitization of migration and refugees on the other hand. And I would like to depart from a basic assumption, namely that security and safety have often been described by many authors as a kind of anthropological constant, while insecurity and uncertainty, on the other hand, can be destructive for human beings. They can be destructive for their personal and their social development. Within popular imagination, home is like the safe haven. Home is the symbol for security and safety. And of course, it's a commonplace that nationalism and nation building have been working so well because the nation state managed to present itself as a kind of home for an imagined community and presenting the members of this imagined community as a kind of family members. So socially, the state is the primary community on very many levels. The state has the monopoly of the legitimate use of force. It guards the borders towards the outside. It maintains public order on the inside. It sends the police if something goes wrong. It defends us in times of war, but it also builds roads, it builds schools and hospitals. And even if it doesn't work as it should, we still relate to the nation state as a kind of home, because sometimes homes can be something also to dislike, and they can be a cause for embarrassment, as Michael Hertzler has shown, for example. So generally, the state's responsibility is to keep us, the inhabitants of its territory, safe. It's a kind of contract, but the contract would be only a rational cost-benefit relationship if it weren't for emotions. Historically, emotions have played an important role in the formation of nation-states. Emotions such as love to your nation-state, but also, as Sarah Ahmed has shown, hate, but also the feeling of being safe and secure. So in my presentation today, I would like to elaborate on the relationship between imaginaries of sovereignty and emergency with regard to the nation-state and the role of emotions. And among the many emotions that do play a role here, I will focus on one, and that is fear. This is not to say that other emotions do not and cannot play a role too. But for this presentation, I would like to argue that fear is an emotional practice. But fear is also a political strategy. Fear is an object to relate to. It can function like a tool. And these both conceptualizations should not be conflated. So to give you a short overview now of what you can expect within the next 35 minutes. First, I would like to talk about the way two examples of the way the so-called refugee crisis has been depicted within Austrian and German media. And I would like to link that to ideas about borders, sovereignty, and the nation state. And then in the next step, I would like to show how securitization and fear in these cases are intertwined. And then I would like to show that on the example of Austrian populist and right-wing extremist discourse on Muslims and refugees more generally, before I come to my conclusion. So, now, the first picture. What you see here is the front page of the German weekly Die Zeit from August 18, 2016. And the big headline reads, "The night that Germany lost control." So this edition of the newspaper was on the occasion, this issue of the newspaper was on the occasion of the anniversary of the border opening for refugees in 2015. You probably all remember that German Chancellor Angela Merkel had decided to allow Syrian and other refugees into the country. She had negotiated with then Chancellor Faymann in Austria that Austria would allow refugees coming from Hungary traveling through Austria to the German border, where they would be met by German police officers and border guards, and then travel further to any destinations. So Merkel had already uttered her famous, now famous words, "Wir schaffen das," we can do this, already on 31st August 2015, and this sentence is actually following her ever since. And Germany also saw unprecedented waves of solidarity towards the refugees, first and foremost at the Vienna and Munich train stations. But Germany also introduced border controls on 13th September 2015 at its internal border to Austria, and many other countries did the same and introduced temporary border controls at their internal border as a kind of emergency measure. So these were generally intended as only temporary measures to handle the influx of refugees and to be able to register them and basically get an overview of who's actually coming. Interestingly, these border controls, although they should be only temporary measures, are still in place, and there's actually a new initiative underway by Austria, Germany, Sweden and other countries to suspend border controls without limit. So that is how even the Schengen Codex would need to undergo some legal changes, but the argument here again is the emergency, the state of the urgency that needs to be met. But back to our front page. Critics back then argued that Merkel's decision had led to an uncontrolled influx of undocumented migrants, that the country had actually been blackmailed by Viktor Orban, that Merkel had made the country vulnerable to terrorists, that German bureaucratic institutions were not able to deal with such high numbers of refugees. And on another page, that their religion, Islam, would make them basically incompatible, that these people would pose a physical and cultural threat to the host society, particularly for our women and girls. So Germany saw a huge upsurge in populism and in violence, and also in attacks on refugee shelters. And in the long run, we see an increasing xenophobic discourse that already started before the so-called refugee crisis, but which got quite a momentum due to summer 2015. And we saw a huge shift towards the right, which can be seen in the most recent electoral success of the AfD in Germany. And even more recent, the recent effect can be seen in the elections in Austria, where soon there's going to be a coalition of right-wing populist and right-wing extremist parties. But back to our front page. So in 2016, 1 year after the border opening, Die Zeit looks back at the border opening and the famous sentence, "Wir schaffen das." And many back then said that Germany lost control when it opened its borders, and that it only regained control in December 2015, as apparently has been secretly admitted by members of the Merkel administration. So my question here is not if that is actually true or what that did actually entail. My question here is, what does it mean to be in control? And what does it mean to lose control? And I think that it's has very much to do with borders and sovereignty. It's also about national identity and cultural hegemony. It's about borders as institutions and as imaginaries. And I want to focus on these points, and I depart from two basic assumptions. The first assumption is that borders do something. Borders have agency. They do make a difference, and they create social spaces. They create obstacles and classifications, but also opportunities. So the border function and the border infrastructure are very powerful devices. But borders are also objects of agency. They are being invoked and imagined. They have a symbolic meaning, and they are an important part of social imaginaries and processes of selfing and othering. So the imagination of the border function and border infrastructure is also very powerful. So why are borders so important for the imagination of the nation state and the imagined community? And I think that has to do with the fact that control is always linked to an imagination of borders and of sovereignty. If we think of Max Weber's classical definition of the state is sovereign if it has the monopoly over the legitimate use of force, if it's able to maintain social order within a given territory over a given population, and if it's able to guard its borders. So one of the most important symbolic functions of national borders is based on the fact that they promise security to the inhabitants of a specific territory. Border controls and the idea of the nation state are inextricably intertwined. Border controls embody the founding myth of the nation state, and they have an important signaling functions that we are here to protect you, the in-group. So borders actually do create an in-group, and by doing so they also create a potentially threatening outside. Crossing the border for the nation state also is an instrument of power, as one of the main purposes of borders is to categorize and to classify mobilities, whether you are a traveler or a migrant or a tourist or a refugee. It's up to the nation state to decide that, so to divide you into those who are welcome and those who are not. But not only the nation state classifies, but also international treaties and all the duties that come with it classify. And that is particularly important in the case of refugees and asylum seekers. So my point is that borders exist differently for very different kinds of mobilities and different kinds of actors, and borders does function like a kind of firewall, and this is where control, again, comes in. So, the night that Germany lost control. There's also a subheadline here, and it reads, what happened on 4th of September 2015? Which intentions, mishaps and misunderstandings led to hundreds of thousands of refugees entering the country? A protocol. So the Zeit insinuates that the suspension of the Dublin Agreement and the influx of refugees is actually equivalent with losing sovereignty over the national territory and the state. Moreover, the border opening was not intentional and not controlled, in the words of die Zeit, but it was actually a sign of bad government. So within this narrative, the opening of borders led to an uncontrolled influx of unknown, and that is, by definition, not classified and not classifiable, and thus potentially bad people. And this discourse is linked to a visual imaginary. If you look at the picture of the family here, I hope you can see that. It's a family that is on a highway trying to get probably from Austria to Germany. We don't know exactly, but they're on a highway. There's a truck behind them, and I'd like to argue that this, the way this family is depicted, the way the picture is arranged, is places the picture within a security meta-frame, as Vida Beitz has called it. So that the way the picture is arranged immediately lets us interpret it through the prism of security. So if you look at the people, you don't look into their faces. They sneak in at night like thieves in the night. It's dark. The whole composition with the truck and the lorry. So the whole picture does not actually engender empathy as it could be, because it's a family, so people like families, right? So, but the whole way the picture is made does not engender empathy, together with the headline. And what I found quite interesting, what a student actually once mentioned to me, was that there's a box here on the right-hand side with a police cap, and it's relating to a completely different article, saying that this is the police speaking. Police officers talk about their everyday lives, and terror is mentioned, and it's yellow, it's a signaling color. So even if this box is not related to the picture itself, it's still the whole composition of the front page gives us an idea of how to interpret the picture and how to interpret the family. And so I think the way this newspaper front page is arranged is very much in line with all those well-known visual and linguistic metaphors that we know so well, like the wall, the fence, the bulwark against the flood, the stream, the avalanche. So these are all metaphors and imaginaries that signal threat, that signal urgency, that make us feel helpless. They are so powerful, they overwhelm us. And in effect, the state cannot fulfill its security promise. So this is the narrative within that work. So obviously this suggests an ideal type of control that cannot and does not exist in reality, because no state knows exactly who is actually on its territory. But within the narrative, the state in such a case is not sovereign anymore. But the state is rather, finds itself in a kind of state of exception. The nation-state is in a state of emergency. It finds itself within a self-defense mode. And that relates to the way Giorgio Agamben has conceptualized the state of emergency. And he was also relating back to Carl Schmitt's idea of the state of exception. Carl Schmitt defines sovereignty as the power to decide the instauration of the state of exception and to act outside the law. So only the sovereign is able to speak exception and to suspend the normal way of politics and to act outside the law. So the state of emergency is actually a speech act with a very performative momentum. And it allows for extreme measures that entail the suspension of legal rights and basic freedoms in order to at least claim to restore safety and security. And I want to give you another example. Under the impression of the so-called refugee crisis, Austria introduced a limit for accepting applications for asylum seekers. So it was agreed upon in Parliament that only 37,500 applications would be accepted in the first year, followed by 35,000 applications in the second year. The 37,500 were not even reached in 2016, but nevertheless there was a huge discussion about that. The country is flooded by refugees and that the country will not survive and that it is in a state of emergency, and states of emergency need specific measures for the country to survive. So actually in autumn 2016, a so-called emergency decree, Notverordnung, was discussed, which was explicitly relating to the state of exception. And it would have included to deny asylum to anyone and to absolutely close the borders, to allow indefinite detention and to cut many legal rights. It was highly doubtful whether that would have been in accord with the Austrian constitution, with any European law or the Geneva Convention. In the proposal that was set forth by the government, the argument was that the internal security and social order of the Austrian state are under threat due to the influx of refugees. And it stated explicitly that high crime rates were expected, that challenges for functioning of bureaucracies and schools, for the housing and the labor market were expected. So they did not relate to actual numbers, saying that we see that there are high crime rates and we see that there is no housing, but they said there might be, we might be expecting that something like that might happen, that challenges might be turning up. So as I said, as the limit for asylum applications was not reached in 2016, the emergency decree was not passed, but the legal basis still exists, so it can be put back on the political agenda any time. But what we saw was a recent, very significant strengthening of immigration laws in Austria. But what I think is important here with regard to the emergency decree is that the invocation and the declaration of the state of exception and the state of emergency, the declaration itself is intended to restore sovereignty, because it sends a message to the own population. It's not so important that there is not actually a crisis in housing, labour market, and so on and so forth. But the point is that to declare the state of emergency already sends a message to the own population. And this is very visible in the way the proposal argued that it was expected, that something might happen. It's not here yet, but yeah. So what happens also is that it's not only a message to the own population, but those who are in need, the refugees and asylum seekers who come, they become a security risk. So there's a semantic shift with very practical consequences for them. They are thereby being externalized. And in this picture, I don't know if you can see that, but it's from the website of a very popular tabloid newspaper. It's a video where I think they are coming from Hungary, crossing the border from Hungary to Austria, and we do not only see a huge mass of people coming, so the flood, the avalanche, which is very much nicely captured in this picture, but maybe you can see that these guys, these are police officers, and they are wearing protective face masks against the contagion that is probably brought in, against the threat that the refugees are posing. The refugees obviously are not wearing protective face masks. So they are already, while entering the country, they are already conceived as a risk for the security and the well-being, for the health of the Austrian body politic. So in both of my examples, I think we see a certain dynamic. There's an external threat that is being identified, or a threat is identified and thereby the people are being externalized. And this threat endangers a referent object, the Austrian or German imagined host society, imagined community. And it does so by drawing upon familiar notions, images, stereotypes, and simultaneously suggesting a remedy for the problem that is being identified. And this is what often has been termed securitization. And I've included a quite long quote by Thierry Balzac, and I've highlighted the important parts for you to quickly have a glimpse. Scholars of international relations have dealt extensively with the concept of securitization, but also anthropologists have begun to adapt the notion of securitization to their own work. And basically the question is, how is an issue turned into a security issue? Who does that? How does it work? And what are the factors that come with it? Traditionally, the securitization approach focuses on the Speech Act and argues that language is powerful and that language is performative, that it has an effect on mobilities and border imaginaries as well. But I think that these scholars tend to miss something quite important, because they tend to miss the importance of emotions for processes of securitization. Because securitization does not only work when people believe rationally that there is a problem that needs to be fixed, but it works particularly well when people feel that they will be doomed unless something is done. So the emphasis here is on feel and doomed. To be sure, Balzac mentions feelings somewhere here. The network of implications, feelings, sensations, thoughts, and institutions that needs to be involved with that. But they rather appear as a kind of byproduct within the whole process. But I'd like to argue that urgency, the urgency that comes with the securitization, that we need to do something now, otherwise we're doomed. It's not only a temporal issue that something needs to be done quickly, but it's an emotional one. Therefore, emotions play an important role in securitizing practices. And I would now like to go on and ask how emotions and imaginaries of threat and security are linked. Too quick. So security issues become urgent and become pressing and powerful through emotions. So what is fear? I want to argue that fear is on the one hand an emotional practice, but on the other hand it's also a political strategy. And I would like to begin with fear as an emotional practice. So as an emotional practice, it's an emotion that relates to an impeding threat, imagined or real. It relates to an anticipation of danger or evil or pain. Fear is a bodily sensation, so both the mind and the body are in this together. Language and images are also part of this imaginary. We can imagine something and anticipate something to happen. This is the human capacity to feel. So we can imagine something terrible to happen and we'll lead our lives accordingly, or think of certain ways to avoid that. Fear does not reside positively in an object or a body. So the refugee is not fearsome in itself, but fear is always relational. Fear sticks. So the refugee body represents fears that are being stick to it. And what I find quite useful is Sarah Ahmed's notion of impression. She says that we are under the impression of fear, and fear makes an impression. It leaves a lasting impression, like a kind of imprint, actually. And that is even the case after it's clear that there is no imminent danger. So Ahmed argues that fear is powerful not because something dangerous takes place every time we fear, but because the object of fear threatens to pass by. This means that when we fear and nothing happens, so there's no terrorist attack, no state collapse, no sexual assault, then the threatening situation is not resolved. It's not that we think, okay, there was no reason to fear, and the next time this happens, I won't be afraid. But the fear is simply adjourned. It might happen any other time. And that is why fear is so powerful, Sarah Ahmed argues. And that is even more the case when knowledge about threats is communicated via, for example, the media or other forms of communication such as social networks. Because many fears do not relate to our own experiences, but to things we read and to things we learn from other people, and things that we have learned before and experienced. So this also adds to our feeling of insecurity. So fear is powerful, and it's hardly accessible to rational counter-arguments. Fears feel real precisely because they are a profoundly bodily sensation that is experienced individually. Emotions cannot be entirely rationalized, and therefore emotions acquire a kind of truth for those who feel them. Also, fear implies an idea of morality. If I fear something that I think is bad, I also must know what is good, because otherwise I couldn't be able to fear the bad, as Corey Robin has described that. So that is why fears are often not perceived as something political. But I think it's vital to ask how fear operates as an emotional, but nevertheless also highly political practice. And in order to illustrate that, I want to draw upon some examples from Austria. I've talked a bit about Austria before, but just some general sentences. Austria is quite a special case because of its geopolitical position right in the middle of Central Europe, on the interface between East and West, and due to its historical role as an old colonial power in the Habsburg Empire, with all the post-colonial implications that brings with it. Interestingly, Islam has been an officially recognized religious community since 1912 due to the annexation of Bosnia by the end of the 19th century. But nevertheless, Austria's function and self-image as a kind of Germanic bulwark against everything Oriental is still pervasive. So against the Turks as the old enemy, and again, or also towards the own Orientals in the backyard, that would be Bosnia. So there's this idea of the good and the bad Oriental, and this is also extending, this narrative is also extending to the Slavic neighboring countries as well. André Gingrich has called this the frontier myth of Orientalism, and he says that it's deeply rooted in Austrian everyday culture, that it also exerts a significant influence on political campaigning, on political decisions and public opinion. Generally, and even more so now that we are past the elections, right-wing populist and extremist positions occupy a very strong position in political and public discourse in Austria. The Freedom Party of the late Jörg Haider, you might have heard about him, a right-wing extremist party, accounts for 1/4, 1/3 of the electorate and will actually be in government together with the Conservative People's Party, which has also, through their new chairman, Sebastian Kurz, taken the road to right-wing populism. And actually the Freedom Party has every right to claim that the People's Party's Minister of the Interior, Sobotka, and Sebastian Kurz stole their agenda and their slogans, so they have every right to be angry, actually. And that is why such positions are not so much perceived as extreme within Austria. So fear operates also as a political practice. Fear is political because what we consider as fearsome is the result of historical narratives and imaginaries about the other. They provide us with a kind of interpretive framework. Fear is often organized along cleavages such as Christian versus Muslim, civilization versus barbarism. And there's always this, or often this, Orientalist theme, or as Haldrup and colleagues have called it, the banal Orientalism that pervades everyday life. And I want to give you an example for that. This is Heinz Christian Strache, the next Minister of the Interior of Austria. He's now the chairman of the Freedom Party. And last year, on 24th October 2016, he gave a speech, a State of the Nation address, because the Austrian National Day is on 26th of October, on the national holiday. So he, under the impression of the so-called refugee crisis, he said in his speech, "Meanwhile, the abyss of evils that apparently are slumbering below the narrow, fragile surface of our civilization, and which until a year ago we had located some 1,000 kilometers south of us, are opening right up in the heart of Europe. The reason for this," he said, "is Völkerwanderung, the invasion of the barbarians, which he says is caused by Angela Merkel, of course, who, he says, I quote, "is not only the most powerful but the most dangerous woman in Europe." And he goes on to say that the rampant influx of culturally foreign poverty migrants seeping into our welfare systems is about to shake our social structure in its very foundations, one that is being upheld by solidarity and social cohesion, making a civil war not unlikely in the near future. So we clearly see this state of emergency that he is invoking in his speech. He says basically the catastrophe is inevitable, and he warns, I quote, "If we strive to preserve our cultural heritage in the long run, we will need to be up to defending it." So he doesn't actually define this cultural heritage, but it's decidedly non-Muslim. It doesn't include the Muslims. So the next Minister of the Interior of Austria. Muslims within this narrative are conceptualized in a certain way. They're framed in terms of kind of a cultural contagion, as a kind of cultural toxic that is perceived to destroy the body politic from the inside. And this builds upon cultural essentialist concepts that derive their power from what Ralph Grillo has called cultural anxiety, and he describes that as concern about cultural identity and loss. So the idea of culture that is in the background here is that culture is something unchangeable you have. It's this old conception of culture that anthropology actually gave up a very long time ago, but which is still out there in the streets and cannot be caught again. So we see, in this picture, we see two older campaigns from the FPÖ. This is from 2006, this is from 2010, and I think this one is very, very nicely also captures this idea of of the way the other destroys us. So they, should this be our future? Austrians say no, Austria stay free. Freedom means freedom from Muslim influences. The woman is under a burqa, and you might notice that this is not simply a burqa, but it's an EU flag, so the EU is actually complicit in the Islamization of Austria. So freedom actually means being free, both from those from below who come and attack us from below, the poor migrants, and also from above, top-down threat from the part of the EU. So we quite clearly can see, I think, this cultural anxiety as a fear of a kind of cultural contagion, of an intoxication of this body politic, who contaminates us, the other who contaminates us, and we lose our identity. And just a quick example from this year's electoral campaign. Here we see the next Chancellor of Austria. He's 31, I think, Sebastian Kurz, who ran his campaign very much again on arguing against the influence of Islam on education, on kindergartens, and so on and so forth, and argued very much against public funding of religious kindergartens, Islamic kindergartens. Many other Protestant, Catholic, and so on kindergartens are obviously funded, but he was arguing against that. And here we see this year's campaign from the part of the FPÖ, where Heinz-Christian Strache was actually arguing that it's the position of the FPÖ that Islamization needs to be stopped, and he was arguing that Sebastian Kurz said Islam belongs to Austria, but Sebastian Kurz was very quick to say, no, maybe I said that, but I didn't mean it that way. So this is how the whole discourse very quickly and very significantly shifted towards the right and got this anti-Muslim momentum. So Kurz is very quick to distance himself from Islam and to externalize it. The role of Austria as a victim to this cultural contagion is most visible in the way gender relations are described, where Muslim men are being depicted as archaic, as treating women like objects because of their culture. And I think these are quite nice examples of the regional branch of the FPÖ in Upper Austria, too beautiful for a headscarf. Yes, to the burqa ban, against the Islamization of Europe. So I think we can see quite clearly here that it's not about women's rights. It's not about women should not be forced to wear things they don't want to wear. But it's an expression, again, of cultural anxiety. It's not about all the women in the world, but it's a very anti-feminist and patriarchal imagination that is coming to the fore here. It's our women, our blonde women. We want to see their hair, and we don't want them to be covered in burqas, so we can't enjoy them anymore. And these anti-feminist and patriarchal imaginations thus get this unholy alliance with racism. And we saw these similar arguments in the current refugee crisis, and I'm sure you know the picture on the left. We saw this particularly after the events of New Year's Eve in Cologne in 2015. So this discourse has a very strong patriarchal and anti-feminist bias. So the picture, I don't have to explain so much about the picture on the left-hand side, I guess, besides the fact that, again, we're having an EU flag here. So again, the EU is on the one hand a victim, but on the other hand it's also complicit, again, because it let all these guys, it allowed these guys actually to come and to rape us while actually destroying the inner values of the EU. And on the right-hand side we see focus, women accused after sex attacks by migrants. Are we still tolerant, or are we already blind? So this whole this whole narrative, of course, didn't start with the so-called refugee crisis, and it's nothing specifically Austrian, Polish, or German, but it belongs to a very powerful narrative that informs the West's self-image, Europe's self-image. These images and symbolic geographies that are connected to that provide a frame for interpretation that can hardly be escaped. And this is not only the case for media narratives, but also for those narratives that we learn in schools, that surround us all the time, and also surround us in popular culture. And these are narratives and discourses that make feelings of belonging look natural, and that privilege certain perspectives, and that externalize other. So fear is not only political in itself, but it also functions as a political strategy. And as a strategy, it has object-like qualities. It functions like a tool. And this has to do with some social characteristics of fear. If someone fears, he or she needs to be protected. It's not with hate or rage where we like to keep a distance. But if someone fears that he or she is weak and not capable to act and needs help, and this engenders empathy, ideally, among the in-group, and often it engenders indifference or contempt towards the out-group. This also does not apply to everyone equally. There are legitimate fears and illegitimate fears. So who is actually authorized to say what fear is legitimate and what? So there are visible fears and invisible fears and concerns. Who is actually entitled to fear and whose voices are heard? Caroline Humphrey says that fear is a property. She says fear is an entitlement. So only a certain status allows for fear and also for the performance of fear. And fear that will be taken up, for example, in the media, or that will find their way on the political agenda. So fear as a political practice brings us back to classifications, to symmetries and hierarchies. Whose security is actually at stake here, and whose fear are we talking about? If you look at current media discourse and political, particularly populist and right-wing extremist discourse, there's only one side of the story. The imaginaries that are being presented focused only on a privileged conception of fear and security. They focus on a white mainstream, which has made the reference point for political discourse and political change. And at the same time, the others, the referent subjects of that fear, are externalized and they're deprived of their humanity. This does not only relate to ways of speaking that are changing, the semantics and meaning change, but also perceptions of law and justice change as a boundary is being drawn around the body politic against intruders. And we can see that, for example, in the difference between notions such as refugee and migrant. If you're a refugee, if you're an asylum seeker, this, it's not just a linguistic difference, but it has a very legal conception that comes from completely different rights and completely different ideas of also how the host society is supposed to treat you. So, to conclude, in this presentation I tried to show that imaginaries and narratives of control and sovereignty are closely linked to the performativity of the nation-state as a home and as a trusted safe haven. Right-wing populist images and imaginaries on refugees particularly draw upon this notion of fear. So we need, I think, first of all, to focus on the importance of emotion when we're researching security discourses. And second, I think we should distinguish between emotional practices on the one hand and political strategies that invoke emotions on the other hand. So as an emotional practice, we need to take fear seriously in our research, and we need to try to understand actors' feelings and worldviews without excusing any eventual racist prejudices that might inform them. As a political strategy, fear diverts attention towards outsiders. It also produces outsiders. It forms an in-group, an imagined community that is being integrated by fear. As a tool, fear has acquired object-like qualities. It can be used, it can be instrumentalized for various purposes. It also can be invoked and used to justify actions, both from the part of those who claim to be afraid, but also on the part of those who claim to act on behalf of those who are said to be afraid. So in both cases, those who are deemed fearful become the reference object for action that cannot be criticized because they are ours. They need help. Something needs to be done quickly. So, yeah, don't ask questions. In effect, the emphasis on an alleged emergency and a state of exception is a political strategy. It informs individual actors' fears as emotional practices, and thus it leaves a lasting impression that potentially undermines democratic conceptions of the state and the society. Thank you very much.